Today I'm gonna build a Spring Boot application with Angular and Spring Boot to authenticate a user with OAuth2 and Google. I've struggled a lot to configure Google because it doesn't implement all the OAuth2 workflows. Google does this to increase the security even more. One of the cases I couldn't configure is put all the authentication in the frontend with the PKCE. So I will implement the authorization code flow in a stateless application and Angular as a frontend. When talking about OAuth2, many servers come in place. The client server, the resources server, and the authentication server. The client server is the one which requests the user authentication. It's the one which wants to access a protected resources. The resources server is the one which contains these protected resources. Sometimes the client and the resources server are the same server. That's the configuration I will use today. And finally, the authentication server is the server which has the authentication information. It can be GitHub, Facebook, Keycloak, or Google. And now, how does the authorization code flow work? Let's say I go to a website to chat, complaining about my kids. Once the website loads, I want to access my personal account, my private messages. But the website doesn't store any credentials. All is delegated to Google. So it asks Google to authenticate the user. Google returns me a URL which displays a login form. Once logged correctly, Google returns to the frontend a code. The backend uses this code to get an access token. This access token is the one which grants me access to personal data. First, I will use it to get the name of the authenticated user. Then the frontend will use it to validate each request to protected data. This is called OAuth token, as it contains nothing, just a random string. The implementation will be very different if I need no login page with a server-side frontend, a stateful application. But what if I want a stateless application with an Angular frontend and some public pages? Let's start implementing this simple example, and little by little the complicated extras. But first I will ask you to subscribe to my channel, a simple click that makes a difference to me. Let's start with a stateful application with a server-side frontend. I start by creating the Spring Boot application. I change the group, Serger, OAuth2, backend. I select Maven, Java, the latest version of Spring Boot, a jar file, Java 17, and let's add some dependencies. I need web, security, the OAuth2 client, Thymeleaf, and DevTools. Let's download and open it with IntelliJ. Let's start by implementing the security. I start by creating a config package where will be located all the configurations, and create the class which contains the security configuration. Security config. I annotate it with the configuration and enable web security. I declare the bean security filter chain with the HTTP security, return HTTP bold, and now configure it. Authorize the HTTP request. I authorize any request as authenticated. All the application will have the roots protected. And protected by what? The OAuth2. I configure the OAuth2 login customizer with defaults. This configures the OAuth2 login page based on the properties file. I will add those configurations later. Let's continue now to my first and unique endpoint to return the home page. I will generate it from Spring Boot with Thymeleaf, and as all the roots are protected, I need to authenticate my user to access the home page. So once authenticated, I have access to the user information, and I will display it in the home page. Let's now create another package for the controllers. And I create the home controller. I annotate it as a controller and get on slash public string home. I inject the model and I use the authentication principal annotation from OAuth2 user. Let's import the model. I just add one attribute, username, from my user. Get attribute name and return the index. This returns the indexed HTML page. Now let's create this index HTML, the home page. It will be located in the templates. Let's create a file, index.html. Define the head with a title, Spring Security, OAuth2, login. And now the body. A title, OAuth2 login with Spring Security. You are successfully logged in with the name. Thymeleaf text. Username. Let's add some style. Font weight. Bold. And one last thing for the backend, the OAuth2 configuration. I change the application properties to an application YAML and add the OAuth2 configuration. Spring Security, OAuth2, Client, Registration, Google. I need the client ID and the client secret. But I need to create the client ID and client secret from Google. So let's go to the GCP console to create an application. Once I create an account on GCP, I need to create an application that will be displayed here. Let's create the OAuth2 client for this application to access the protected data. I go to the API and Services and Credentials. Here I click on Create Credentials. I choose the OAuth2 client and now I select the web application. I give a name, my full stack app, and now I add the authorized JavaScript origins. It will be the current Spring Boot application at HTTP localhost 8080. I also add the Angular application I will use later. HTTP localhost 4200. In the redirect URLs, I add the default URL used by Google. HTTP localhost 8080 login OAuth2 code Google. I will also add the URL for my Angular project. Click on Create, and now I have the client ID and the client secret. Let's copy both. Let's now start my application. When accessing the home page at localhost 8080, I'm directly redirected to the Google login page. I select my account, and here is the home page, the index HTML I've created. From Google, I receive the username, which is displayed here. This was the first step. Configure the OAuth2 authentication with my Spring Boot application. Now I will edit my security configuration to allow some public pages. I start by setting my homepage and all the routes under public as not protected. Request matches the homepage and all under public as permit all. I let the rest unchanged and go to the homepage. I remove from the homepage the OAuth2 user, as now it is public and it has no user. And now I will create two controllers, a public one and a private one. Let's start by the private one, private controller. I add the controller annotation, get mapping on messages. Public string private messages, and now I add again the authentication principal annotation and the model. As before, I inject in the model just the name in the body. User get attribute name and return a response HTML page. Let's go to the public controller. Public controller. I add again the controller annotation. Get mapping. This time it must start with public. Messages. Public string. Public messages. And I only inject the model. I add one attribute, body the same, but this time with the value nobody, and return the same page. Let's edit the index HTML to read both the public and private content. I remove all this and start. H1 endpoints, H2 the private, unlimited list with a link to the private endpoint, href at the messages endpoint, the private messages endpoint, private endpoint where Google else is required. And now I do the same with the public one. Public, public, public endpoint where no authentication is required. And now the response with the content of the public and private endpoints. A new HTML file, response.html, head, title, Spring Security, OAuth2 logging response. Body, I add a link to come back to the home page. Come back to home. A title, response, free with the span which contains the body. Let's test all together. I run. Here is the indexed HTML, where I can see both links, the private and the public one. If I click to the public endpoint, I have the response page with no body. I can go back with the link and now I click on private. it redirects again to the login page of Google. I click on my username and I am redirected to the response page I've created. Now the username is displayed as the body. Now my application has public content and private content. It's time to start with Angular. But when I use an external frontend, Google will redirect to another URL. So the cookies won't work the same way. What I will do is leave the resources server in the Spring Boot application. It worked well with the access token, but for the client server, I need to implement it by my own. I will use the Google API to authenticate the user. Let's start updating the dependencies. I will add the dependency Google API client. It comes from Google API client. And the latest version is the 2.2.0. I will replace the OAuth2 client by the OAuth2 resources server. And I will also add another one, Spring Webflux. Reload the Maven project. As I have an external frontend, now I need to adapt the course. Let's add this configuration. Web config. I add the configuration annotation, declare the bean, public web MVC configurer, course config, and only return the configuration of the course. I choose the method add course mapping. Registry, add mapping on root. I allow the methods get, post, and options, and allow the origins HTTP localhost 4200. Now I update the configuration to use the resources server instead of the client server. Client security, resource server, opaque token, introspection URI, https googleapis.com, and leave the client ID and client secret. I've been trying to configure Spring Security to work with Google, but never succeeded. Instead, I found a way to make it work with a custom Introspector to read the user information once authenticated. So let's implement this custom Introspector. First, I created a web client to call the Google API and obtain the user's information. Create a new class, web client config. This time is a component, private string introspect URI, which comes from the value string security OAuth2 resource server opaque token introspect URI. I define the bean, public web client, user info client, and return the web client. Builder, base URL, the introspect, and build. That's it. And now I configure the Spring Security. I will add my web client, private, final web client, user info client. I add the constructor to inject it. And now I start by the course configuration. Customizer with defaults. I add an exception handling. Customizer authentication entry point. I return an HTTP status entry point with the HTTP code status unauthorized. This adds a custom exception handling. Otherwise, if an exception occurs, it redirects to the home page. Now, the session management. Customizer, session creation policy as stateless. I leave the roots as they are and change the OAuth2 configuration. I choose the resources server, opaque token, customizer with defaults, and change the client server to a resources server using the opaque token. I will add now another pin. Public opaque token Introspector. And with the opaque token comes the custom Introspector. Turn new Google opaque token Introspector. And I send the user client. Let's implement this Introspector. I create the class. In the config package, it implements the opaque token with the web client, private final web client. I inject the client in the class, user info client, and override the introspect method. From the front end, I send a token in the authorization header. Then I receive it as an input parameter in this method. So I call the Google API to get with the URI builder path OAuth2 v3 user info, and I send as a query param the access token. Build, retrieve the response, body to mono to a class that I will create, user info, and block. Let's create this class into a new package, DTOs. We'll create it as a record with the fields string sub, name, given name, family name. All those are fields received by the access token. So I must respect the structure of the Google API. Picture, the email verified, and the locale. I use the web client to call the Google API, add the token as the query param, and receive the response into this object. And now I return a new OAuth2 Introspector authentication principal with the user info, the name, some attributes that I will build now, and no authorities. Let's build the attributes. It will be a map of string and object, new hash map, I will just put the sub and the name. So my application is ready to be have as a resources server. Let's implement the client server side using the Google API. We saw before that when I try to log in, I had a link which redirects the user to the Google Authentication page. So I will create an endpoint to generate this URL. A new controller, auth controller. This time it will be a REST controller. I will inject the client ID and the client secret from the value of the properties. Spring, security, OAuth2, resource server, opaque, token, and client ID. Client secret. Now the endpoint to get the URL, URL, that must be also public. I will add it in the security configuration, /auth all, and return a response. Entity, which is a URL DTO. Let's create this URL DTO as a record in the DTOs package. String URL, nothing more. Here I call the new Google authorization code request URL with the client ID, the redirect URL, which is the frontend, local host 4200, the list of the scopes I want, arise as list, the email, the profile, and the open ID. And now I build, and this returns me the URL. Now I can return it in my DTO. This will generate the link where the user can see the login form of Google. And this is the callback URL I want Google to call my frontend, as it's the one which manages the redirections. When Google redirects to the frontend, it sends a code with the URL. I need this code in the backend to obtain the access token. So I create a new endpoint to handle this code. Auth callback. Public response entity. This time it returns a token DTO. Let's create this DTO as a record in the DTOs package. String token. And I receive as a request parameter code, the code. And now I call another one, Google authorization code token request. This time I must specify the HTTP transport. Net HTTP transport. Now the JSON factory. Need JSON factory, the client ID, the client secret, my code, the callback URL again, and now I execute and get only the access token. I read the token, surround with a try catch. I return resp response entity with the status, HTTP status, unauthorize it, and if everything went okay, I return the response entity OK with my token. This token is the one sent back to the frontend, and the frontend will use it in the authorization header. Let's now adapt the public and private endpoints. There will be now REST controllers, which returns a response entity of message detail. Let's create this record. Return response. Entity, OK, message detail with private content with the name. With authentication principle, now I read only one field, expression, the name, string name. The name is read from the access token and directly injected in this method. Let's now edit the public endpoint, a REST controller. As before, it returns a response entity of message detail, but this time I have no authentication principle annotation. So it returns response entity OK, message detail with public content. Nothing more. I have my backend ready, configured as a resources server, and the authentication done with Google manually. Now I'm going to configure the frontend, a simple application with Angular. It will contain a login button to display the URL, a public content, and the private content. Let's go. ng new frontend. I will use the default settings, so no CSS, and wait until the Node packages are installed. Let's now generate some few components. ng generate component login form to display the URL from Google. ng generate component public content to display the public content. Private content to display the private content. And ng generate a service, my HTTP client, to include in all the requests the token, the authentication token. In the root component, I will add the logic to switch between the login URL, the public content, and the private content. Let's open the HTML and remove everything. I start with a body and a title. My awesome app. Now a simple button which redirects to the login. And now display all the components. App login form, app public content, and app private content. I will display the login form only if ng if a variable component to show is equal to login. For the public content, the variable must be public, and for the private content, the variable must be private. And when I click on the login button, I change the value of the variable to login. The public content will be displayed by default. When clicking on the login button, I want to display the Google login URL. And once authenticated, I display the private content. Let's go now to the TypeScript file. I create the variable string with the default value public. I create the constructor with the HTTP client, with my HTTP client, and the root dependency. This one will be used to read the code in the URL. So, when loading the frontend in the ng-on-init method, I will check if there is a code in the URL. This root, I read the query params and subscribe to read the values. Params. If there is a params named code and it is not undefined, I request the token. And when requesting the token, if the result is true, I display the private content. Otherwise, I display the public content. Let's now edit the public content HTML. I start with a title, public content, and a paragraph with the content. Nothing more. Let's go to the TypeScript. I create the variable content, initialized empty. In the constructor, I will inject the HTTP client, my HTTP service. And when loading the component, I call the backend to request the public content. HTTP get public messages. This is the URL where I get the public content. I subscribe to the response. It will be a data of type message. And I save the result in the content variable. Let's create this class. Export class message constructor with just one field, message, as a string. Let's import it, message from message. I will also add the HTTP service, my HTTP client service. Let's add the same import in the root component and continue with the private component. I start with the HTML. As before, div with a title, private content, and a paragraph with the content. In the TypeScript, I also inject the HTTP service, constructor, private HTTP, my HTTP service. I initialize the content empty, and when loading the component, as before, I request the backend. but this time I request the private endpoint, which is messages. Subscribe to response, data message again, and the result will be saved in the content variable. I also add the message import. That's it. My public and private content components are ready. Let's go to the login form component. In the HTML, I add a title, login form, and a link, href, with a URL, signed in with Google. That's it. Let's go to the TypeScript and request this URL. I will import the HTTP client, initialize the URL variable empty, inject the HTTP client in the constructor, and when loading the component, I request the backend to obtain the URL in the endpoint auth URL. Now subscribe to the response, data any, and save the result in the URL. Okay, my 3 components are ready. Let's go now to the HTTP service. I start by creating a token variable, initialized empty, where will be saved the token to access the private content of the backend. I inject the real HTTP client. Let's import it from Angular, common HTTP, and create the 3 methods. The get to obtain the public content, return this HTTP get the URL of the backend, get private to read the private content, the protected content, return this HTTP get localhost 8080 URL with the headers this time. New HTTP headers. Let's import this one with authorization bearer plus the token. Let's add in the module the HTTP client, import HTTP client module from Angular common HTTP. I will also add the router module. Router module from Angular router. This one is to read the query parameters from the URL for route. And now implement the latest method to obtain the token from the backend. Get token, I send the code and return an observable. Return this HTTP get token from HTTP localhost 8080 auth callback with the code and add a parameter observe response. This is to obtain an observable. Pipe the response, which is an HTTP response of token if the response status is 200 and the response body is not null, I save the token. Response body token. Then return true. Otherwise, return false. Let's create the token object. Token.ts export class token constructor with only one field, public token. That's it. Let's add the missing imports. HTTP response token observable from RxJS and map from RxJS operators. Let's now test all together. Here is the home page where I have the login button and the public content displayed by default. If I click on the login button, I have the URL to login with Google. Let's click. It redirects me to the login form of Google. I select my account and I am redirected again to the home page with a code in the URL. Now I can load the private content where I displayed the private message, which is my name, the username of the authenticated user. With the most basic configuration, I have a complete protected application by Google with a server-side rendering frontend and stateful. Then I changed the security configuration to allow some public pages, but still a server-side rendering frontend and stateful. Finally, I've converted my backend to a resources server, and I handle the login with Google with the Google API. This way, I create an Angular frontend and a stateless backend. That's all for this video. I hope you liked it. Please click on the like button, subscribe to my channel, and see you soon. Bye!